So we have Wubi for Windows, obviously. I'd like us to have Wubi for Mac, given how quickly growing an audience it is, and how miserable an experience using the Mac with Ubuntu is currently. This requires HFS plus journal write support, because we need to be able to mount the file system read write. But it doesn't just affect Wubi, right? It means that if you have a Mac, you can actually access your Mac partition and write to it as well.
There's one other thing I'll ask about while Andrew's thinking about that. One of the hardest bits about Wubi on Windows is that we have to support being loaded by the Windows bootloader, which loads a grand total of 16 sectors of disk, which is not enough for grub, so we have to have this awkward intermediate thing that knows just about enough about NTFS to load the rest of grub, i.e. grub for DOS, more or less. I'm not quite sure what the arrangement should be on the Mac. I assume that we can't install a separate bootloader in front. We would have to be chain loaded by the Mac bootloader somehow. And I don't even know if it's flexible enough to do that.
I suspect not.
Does anybody even have references or?
Anyone know? I mean, it's something we can most certainly dig into before this becomes a requirements thing. But at the very least, we could do something with Rapid or something.
Just finding some docs and having a look. There's a load of stuff about firmware, bootloader, bootx is the default bootloader. Ooh, it's moderately powerful. It can load ELF kernels off X2. However, that's kind of useless, but in this case.
Why is that useless?
Because we'd have a loopback thing, and I bet it doesn't understand loopback.
But we could always show something up front that isn't loopback, and
well, that's true. It looks to me like it's. Just trying to figure out how configurable it is. I'm not sure you can get it to display a menu.
But even if we had it get us to grub, and then like grub handles nothing between Mac and Ubuntu, that would be sufficient.
Yeah. We would suddenly be stressing a lot of code in grub that isn't used very much.
Are we not doing this?
Well, yeah, okay, we are ready. But there is an XNU loader in grub that is supposed to be capable of loading the Mac kernel, and it's one of the things that the main upstream maintainer tests, so it probably does actually mostly work. I've got a feeling at the back of my mind that there are corner cases it doesn't have. It takes a bit of. Yeah. It sometimes needs a bit of manual attention to get it to boot. So I'm cautious that we need to make very sure that we're not, but that by interposing an extra bootloader, we aren't making people's OS X systems unbootable. Yeah, one of the things about Wubi is that it's, from the Windows point of view, it's relatively safe.
Yeah. Well.
Not sure the bits where it isn't, but at least it's not unsafe at the bootloader level.
Mostly.
Do you know of cases where it blows up? I mean, the case where it generally blows up is if you unmount things uncleanly in various ways. But
I could have sworn there was some issue around us doing, or the anti-bootloader getting a bit confused. But I could be wrong.
Oh, okay. I don't remember that, but you know, at least in principle, the anti-bootloader is loading the Windows kernel directly, and we don't have to care so much about that. Whereas in this case, we'd be interposing another bootloader, so we need to be very, very careful.
Yes. So, assuming we could figure all that out, do you think we could get kernel team time to actually do HFS write support? The spec is there. It literally just requires someone to read it and implement
journal file systems are a high-risk place to play. As we can mount read-write without a journal, why do we need it?
Because in order to, you can do that, but it means you have to go and manually turn off the journal in OS X before it will let you.
Which is less than ideal.
Which is less than ideal, and also, I mean, in the case of Wubi on OS X, that would essentially mean turning off your journal semi-permanently, which is obviously not necessarily something you want to do.
It's not clear that you can't still mount it with the journal as long as it's cleaned. I think you have to incant every dead chicken stomach left to make it let you do it, but you would obviously still be running without a journal during the time you were running Ubuntu.
Yeah.
That we might be able to do. I think, I can take an action to go and look at how hard it is. I suspect if it was easy, it would have been done.
I don't know. I mean, the original code is quite old. I suspect it may be a case of someone implementing as far as they had time for, and then just dropping it.
But that gives me low confidence in the quality of the actual read-write code. If I'm
I
honest.
mean to say, yeah. Right.
So that's a concern. I mean, certainly we can have a look. I suspect it's quite a lot of work to be sure that it's right. And that's the worry.
Yeah.
Really is
It is a substantial request, certainly.
we certainly would have to go away and think about how long it might take.
It would be nice at least to have some idea of possible workaround.
Yeah, what is the actual issue? That the bootloader sucks in OSS, so it's really hard to get the machine installed correctly so that it works in a dual boot
There
environment.
are tons of issues.
It's more that the rationale for Wubi and related things is more that repartitioning scares people. It's a scary commit thing. The reason why we bother with Wubi, even though it's a big, shaky stack of stuff, is that it lets you conceptually install Ubuntu as if it were an application within your operating system to some extent, and that you can install it, you can try it out relatively safely and can uninstall it without serious repercussions if you decide that it's not needed. And that's quite a powerful thing to do. So
Yeah. So it's more about avoiding partitioning than anything else.
mostly.
Yeah, but there's also the issues of EFI being an absolute nightmare for us on OSX.
Right, so that's a separate part to it, which is why I'm alluding to. There are two things that spring to mind. There might be a half-highway house, which would get you at least that part where we use put the data in a partition, but you boot through, as it were, like the way you're talking about, through the actual file system.
Like boot camp.
Wait, sorry,
Is that-
run it by me again.
If it's the bootloader side that's the problem, because you actually start Linux by clicking on it, don't you, in Wubi, as it were.
No.
You actually still have boot.
Yeah. I think it's more the partitioning side that
Yeah.
is relevant.
So I think we should certainly, as well as scope of how much work it is to add the journal side, there's certainly, for a quick scan, there's definite discussion of how you can have journals on, and as long as the file system is clean, you can force mount it, ignoring the journal in Linux, so it doesn't update the journal.
Yeah.
And then you can still remount it as a journal file system when not in Linux. So that might be an interim position we could take, but that would need investigating to check that actually isn't dangerous.
Wouldn't that be enormously shaky, given that if you just power off, you're screwed?
don't have a journal, that's true.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean you're screwed. It just means that you may have to do, OS X may have to do file system recovery.
Right. So it depends if you can reliably tell it that if it's not clean, that the journal is invalid in some way.
Right. Which you probably can. That'll be a matter of clearing a bit, more or less, or deleting a file or something.
Yeah, I would assume that there's some, because it must be possible for the journal to be missing.
It is.
We just don't want to get into a situation where we cause the journal to delete itself and become gone, and then they never know that they don't have one anymore. So yeah, if somebody wants to put an action to size the work and to investigate that, I can do that.
Can someone, I don't know if anyone has actually typed stuff into the document.
Somebody's created it, but it has German right support, so I'll turn that into an action for
Thanks.
Andy.
One of the other things that I'd like to do is, so part of this is this big push to actually make Wubi work properly end to end so that we can really kind of get behind it and make it the default option for Windows users coming to the website, I'll say at some point. Part of that has to be testing. So I'd really like to brainstorm how we test Wubi. The best option I could think of is something like a KVM auto test, because that would at least allow us to handle the case whereby the bootloader falls over, which seems to be the common case of failures for Wubi.
Yeah, it's certainly not unusual for the bootloader to fail, as you say, whether it's at the grub. It's usually not at the boot manager stage or anti-loader boot manager stage. It's usually either grub for DOS failing or grub failing in some way. I'd like to note one or two specific things. There's one, there's a known problem where if grub for DOS finds it's confused by ext4. If it finds an ext4 file system before it reaches the NTFS partition, or the partition that Wubi is actually on, then it falls over entirely. And I'm giving myself an action to fix that. Wubi is not an acronym for, not usually written as an acronym for reverse typing. That's you, isn't it?
Does grub give us like a debug console on the serial port or something like that? Or can it?
So I say it again.
Does grub have the ability to give us a debug console on the serial port?
Yes.
Could we leverage that in some way?
Sure, although it's not entirely unusual for the failure to be before you get that far, but yes, it's certainly possible. Although I don't know if, well, I mean, I suppose you could set debug and emit a load of crap on the serial port, and that might be helpful.
Just parse that.
It's not even a little bit guaranteed to be parsable, but you could at least look at it and see what you could log it. Yeah.
Which would be a bit more helpful than just the test failed.
It would be more helpful than a black screen or similar, which is the usual position. There's one thing I'd like to do is I'd like to generally try to, the more different that Wubi is from a normal system, the more we have problems. So it's the best thing we can do for a lot of these cases is to harmonize what we're doing. At the moment, the Wubi image is a giant monolithic grub image rather than a modular one, which is at variance with what we normally do. And there's been, at the very least, some confusion caused by that. So I'd like to, I realized kind of late in the NATI cycle there's really actually no reason for it to be monolithic. So I'd like to take an action to make that modular.
I don't suppose, the interplay between QEMU and grub, specifically this stuff that you were kind of working through this past cycle in debugging, gives us anything in terms of testing. You know, if we kind of break it down to just testing the bootloader part of it rather than all of Wubi, if we assume that the rest is fairly stable and we kind of focus in on that area.
Yeah, so I was using that just because I didn't have any other way to attach GDB.
Yeah.
I have been working on the Grub GDB stub, partly inspired by that, but you know, that's separate. It does give you a way to at least to get some kind of execution trace in principle. It's extraordinarily slow. I attempted to run QEMU with, well, there's a thing in GDB, I think it is, that lets you dump out all of the output to all of the single step tracing to a file. But in order to be using that, you have to be running GDB in single step everything mode, and it was taking hours to boot. It was
but maybe that
really,
is
really slow.
maybe that is almost acceptable. I mean, if we're doing it in a continuous integration type fashion, whereby because we can fork off one of these for every commit, then hours isn't exactly bad.
Well, it was taking hours to get to the point where it was failing in this case, which was relatively early in Grub.
Right.
I would estimate it would probably take days to actually boot a system. So I don't think quite that full is. I'm not really interested in having a full debuggable execution trace out of the auto test every time.
Yeah.
It's more useful to have something that identifies failures and is capable of telling us roughly where.
Oh yeah. Well, what about the possibility of, because we could kind of smoke test it, right? Like, we could go through the speedy path for the normal case, and then if it fails, then we could fork it off and have it do the hours or days thing. Or do you think that really should just be a manual thing that we do?
I think it's probably, I mean, by the time you get to that point, you really want to be attaching GDB yourself and stepping through it. It's probably not worth having that done automatically, but it would be really helpful to produce an image that you could go and debug. So, you know, I have at the moment a machine that I have Windows on, and I use as a sacrificial Wubi test machine, and as long as it's reproducible on that, then I can reproduce it. But if it's something like, you know, Jean-Baptiste occasionally finds something that only reproduces on French Windows, say, due to the different stuff in the boot.ini file. If it's something like that, or if it's something that we only see on a particular version of Windows, which isn't the one I have, it's, you know, it's much more difficult. Wubi is at the moment essentially impossible to debug remotely.
Yeah.
So.
But I think just the start of being able to, again, go to KVM auto testing and to have something whereby we're at least knowing where we can create a number of scenarios, you know, a couple of different copies of Windows, different languages, things like that, different file system configurations, and just have it run through in KVM, and then
presumably we can
report failures. Yep.
Use sort of one of the screen scrapey type.
Well, that's a KVM auto test, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that will let us kind of plow through that thing.
Agreed.
Hardware being the problem there, though.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with, so the problems through the last cycle were pretty much that we were broken up until about Alpha 3 or thereabouts. I then did a sort of 3-day debugging pass and managed to fix whatever it was that was going wrong at the time. It was a regression in Grub's being booted from something that looks a bit like Linux system. So, you know, once we got through that, fine. Then we hit something else, but we only found. I think that the other bug was there from the start, but whatever I'd done to my test system, it didn't happen to trigger. It was a little bit sensitive. So, you know, I got out of the 3-day debugging session, didn't really fancy doing another pass of assurance on top of that. And that's the sort of thing that CI would have just told me immediately, and
Yeah.
I wouldn't have had to sweat over it.
It's probably also makes some amount of sense that the code seems to be fairly stable in this respect to do some sort of unit testing around. Maybe it just doesn't have a test suite at all.
Right.
But that would
I think it
largely
probably
be the
does
UI
have
code.
to. It probably does have to be a. The main thing I think would be system testing on the whole thing. The UI code, it does go wrong occasionally, but I'm a lot less worried about it. It's tractable.
Yeah. If it fails there, it's also less of an issue than if it fails in the spot.
Right. So I think we're at least now past the problem. In Natty, we're past the problems with, or mostly past the problems with upgrades just failing all over the place, particularly upgrades from one release to the next.
Will that hold, do you think? Or will someone just kind of accidentally break it again?
I think my fixes are fairly robust. What was the most recent fix?
The multiple disk thing?
Well, no, the multiple disk was part of it, but I'm just trying to remember. Oh, the most recent fix were, well, okay, there were some fixes to the multiple disk thing which had been a thorn in our side for years. It basically never worked. That's pretty robust. It's a hacky shell script, but it's, I think, fairly solid. The other fix was use of freed memory in the loopback device thing, and I think that fix is fairly solid as well. I'd be surprised if that regressed. So it's still something to watch out for, but the relevant fixes are as far upstream as they can go. They're not going to get lost or anything like that. So.
Okay. So I think that's sufficient coverage of testing. I think we just start with KVM auto test and see where that takes us. Windows licenses. Do we have an MSDN license? I've heard murmurs that we do. I mean, I've got a few.
I'm not sure about MSDN. We do have a scheme whereby canonical platform engineering members can get Windows licenses from some kind of pool.
Yeah.
Did you get a block for your test farm?
No, because the test farm is built off of netbooks that come with Windows anyway. So I just I did part image or something like that and sucked all of those down. So I still have those images. Whether or not they work, I don't know. But I at least have the license keys for those.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm more curious about. I know the licenses are different when you're talking about using Windows in a VM. So potentially.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the details. So.
Well, that could be figured out. So we had a hallway conversation about this, but it's probably worth mentioning here. Simplifying the experience, and that right now, when you do a Wubi install, you get the executable, it downloads the ISO, so that takes a fair bit of time. And then
it only does that if you're not running off
but the general case, I suspect, is going to be people are getting the executable because we're not doing ship it anymore, and the likelihood of them burning the CD with Wubi. Anyway, you then reboot, and it gives you a menu to either go back into Windows or install Ubuntu, with Windows being the default selection. If you're clever enough to go to install Ubuntu, then it goes in and it actually runs through a preceded installation of Ubuntu. When that's done, it reboots again and gives you the option of booting into Windows or booting into Ubuntu, the options being in the NT bootloader rather than grub. And I can't remember, does it pop up the grub menu once you get through to the Ubuntu side?
I think that as a result of Wubi being out of sync with grub in a couple of there is a bug about that.
Yeah, we should.
Let me just dig out the bug report. I made somebody file it at the release sprint. 771732. I'll pop it into Etherpad.
Thanks.
Yeah, maybe you file it. In fact.
So this is horrendous. Like I really feel like Windows users are just going to balk at this. So what I'd like to do is remove as many of those choices as possible. Starting with that first one, when you reboot the first time, it should just go into the Ubuntu installation.
Does it show the menu with it selected or not show the menu at all?
No, not show the menu at all. Just go straight into it. So you have the restart now option in Wubi, and you hit that, and then it reboots and goes in the second stage of the installation.
Yeah.
I mean, ideally, I don't want a second stage at all, but we also talked about this in the hallway, and it seems slightly unfeasible. Though
it amounts to yet another image, essentially.
it does, yeah, but well, I'll bring it up again just for the sake of doing so. So the idea I had was to have a compressed ext3 image or something like that on releases.ubuntu.com. Wubi would then suck that down. It would uncompress and DD that onto into a file, and then when you reboot, it would effectively be booting up Ubuntu for the first time, assuming it could do all the bootloader stuff as well. Taking care in the init ramifest to actually do the applying of the locale and things like that, the stuff that Thor does. But that, I think we said, it's pretty horrendous. Oh, and this actually segues into the next point of where we can fix things, and that's to use kexec.
Right. So that one I actually think is a lot more feasible, to be honest. The reason we don't kexec out of the normal installer is that I very strongly believe that we need to ensure that the bootloader actually works. Now, in the case of Wubi, there aren't any bootloader choices anyway, and if the bootloader doesn't work, then there's nothing you can do about it.
And you wouldn't have gotten to that point anyway.
Right,
And
so
you-
the path is not different than how you got there.
The path is essentially the same as as you say. So I'm more sanguine about using kexec in that case, as long as we aren't going to be. I have heard mutterings about kexec's reliability at fairly fundamental levels. So
Andy, can you comment on that?
I haven't had any particular complaints on primary architectures. ARM, I've got a lot of complaints.
I don't think we'll be seeing Windows ARM machines.
For a while.
Well,
Okay.
and we won't be running Wubi on them. I hope. And well,
Let's just score this one for
I had a conversation with David about this on the way here, but it's
do
not anytime soon. Let's go.
you want to task me for doing grub and ARM?
No, I don't.
I actually have part of the port. But yeah.
So that seems feasible enough. I mean, we can at least give it a try and see where it goes.
So we would need to. Ottavio Salvador was talking about this in Debian. He doesn't believe me that bootloaders occasionally go wrong, I think, and or something like that, and wants to kexec out of the installer. And right, anyway, okay, so I think some of that work has been done. I don't think it's actually in Debian properly yet.
So it's in some Git tree somewhere.
Probably, or somebody's disk. It's not hard anyway, right? In fact, thinking about it, I suppose we wouldn't actually need DI code for that. We'd just have Ubiquity do a kexec directly.
Yeah. Can you write that? Thanks.
I'll give that one to you.
Yeah. And I think that would largely solve the issues, and do away with this not necessarily need but desire to have the ext3 compressed image deal on the disk, because it's effectively the same thing. And this is where the hallway conversation went, except instead of having a very long Plymouth screen, you have a very long, nice X screen with a progress bar. So the experience then becomes: you start in Windows, you start Wubi, it downloads the ISO, does scrub, you reboot, it goes straight into the second stage installation, which shows you the progress bar finishing up, K-exec, and then you're in the new system. So it's significantly smoother.
Was there a reboot in there?
The first reboot of the second stage.
Yeah.
When I
Are
said
you
grub.
still talking about stopping that, asking for the menu, or?
Yes, that will not give you a menu at all in this case. You will just go straight into the installation. The second stage of the installation.
Right.
Yes?
I'm just taking your word for it. It's Windows. It's something I haven't seen for a while. It's actually a big.
I think from this point we're at random other things. Oh, well, we should address Wubi migration, but one of the other things that I'll mention now before it pops back out of my brain is that Windows 8 is going to have an app store, apparently.
It looks just like ours.
Well, good.
No, I mean, I was like, they had to have seen ours.
Yeah.
So, like, it looks.
Well, so I think I know what you're talking about. Those are faked.
Oh.
They were.
Okay.
Yeah, but apparently it is going to have an app store. Just no one's seen it yet. But anyway, we should try to get in there. Modulo licensing issues. But hey, we could always relicense Wubi under the Apache license.
I had to point it out that Wubi includes a grub image.
Which, yeah.
We do not have the rights. Sorry for all that, but you can't actually relicense it.
Wubi migration.
Right, so that's the big remaining piece.
I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but I think you would put in there that someone has actually, Jesus, time went quick.
No, it's a short session. This is the 45-minute session, but there's also a 15-minute pause straight after it.
Right, so I put links into the spec whiteboard. The prototype does take the form of a shell script. It's
Where does
not
it come from?
it's one of the most prolific Wubi testers.
No, I mean, so there are a number of different ways you can do the migration.
Oh, right.
You can do it from CD, you can do it from the actual system in some scary ways. And which approach does it take? Does it do like library size?
It's, I'm just looking at how it does it. I think that right now it doesn't do the partitioning itself. It assumes that you've already created the partitions from a live CD or something.
I remember that being the case when I looked at that.
Yeah. So in particular, it talks about dev SDA5 and SDA6 and assumes those already exist. So from in the case of that's certainly one of the hard bits, and that's why I think we talked about it being a mode in the installation. So you stick in a USB stick with the usual Ubuntu USB stick. It notices that you have a Wubi partition and asks you if you want to migrate.
So I figured if we went down that path, the way of doing it would be to do it at partman. So when it's iterating over the disks, it would see that it would look for the Wubi known location, would find it, and would give it as a partman auto option. And then in Ubiquity, we would say if that partman auto option exists, then ignore all the other ones, or maybe show it in addition to them.
Right, so it's certainly possible to dig into it. I think that some of this has become more feasible now that we can do true read-only mounts, so that we don't have to be worried about replaying the NTFS journal, all that sort of rubbish. So it should now be feasible to inspect NTFS partitions safely. And if grubmount can't read them, then they won't boot anyway.
To throw an option out of far left field, NTFS 3G, live resize, and we know if it works. It does in Windows, apparently.
I do not know.
And do we...
NTFS 3G, as far as I know, doesn't have... I think you're thinking of NTFS resize, which is not part of NTFS 3G. It's part
I thought they pushed all the stuff out of partman.
No, it's not. It's not.
Sorry.
It's not in either part out or part man, but it's not in NTFS 3G either. It's in the old NTFS progs. No, it is written by the same guy who did NTFS 3G, but I believe it's part of a different suite. But anyway, yeah, it's part of NTFS progs. Live resize or just
Live resize, yeah. I know you're not generally a fan of that. But.
I'm just looking to see if it supports it. It doesn't document supporting it. It doesn't. It's not very explicit, but things that resizing tools that support online resize tend to say it all over the place because it's so hard. So I think it probably doesn't support it right now.
So the reason I mention is I do have a concern that it's when we start throwing, create a USB disk with the installation image, it gets a bit complicated. That's fine for a first cut pass, as long as we have something in place, some recourse for them to go to a full Ubuntu system. Great, but in terms of long-term planning, I'd like to see if maybe we can evaluate, if this does get pushed into an option whereby the majority of Windows users are getting this as their Ubuntu experience, then potentially contracting him or someone else to implement that so that we can at least, or just coming up with a different solution so that we don't have to pull in external media.
I mean, I can't really comment with any accuracy on contracting, but I suspect that he might be amenable to doing online resize. We would have to, but I haven't talked to him for ages. Yeah. We would also have to make sure that there's lots of partitioning complexity in there as well. I think if we're assuming that this needs to happen if we're presenting it to lots of Windows users, then we need to do it first.
The live resize?
If you think that this is essential to make things work well for Windows users, then we need to do it before presenting it as presenting it more prominently.
I think I suspect most Windows users are going to be happy with the arrangement that they're given right from the outset. Okay. In terms of just having Wubi. I have no data to back this up. This is just my gut feeling. Equally, I think actually using the migration thing is going to be less than ideal. I think we can do a lot there in terms of documenting it. The web team is really great for these kinds of instructions. But I don't think it's the ideal path that we want to put them on. So that's why I said long term, like just something to evaluate once we get to that point. I mean, we should do user testing at the very least and actually see, is this a stumbling block or not?
Quite.
And in fact, can someone put an item in there for actual user testing with Wubi? And equally on that, design work on Wubi. I had talked to John Lay, and they are going to make time for it, but he was saying, he was asking if it was okay if it's like 4 weeks from now, rather than now. And I said, that's probably fine, but I would like to sit down with him once we get back into the office and just kind of talk through where we want to go with that. But I mean, at the very least, we need to update the artwork. It's like, it isn't even proper Ubuntu artwork from like 804. It's just some weird.
Yeah, right. The branding is out of date.
Yeah.
Do you want an action to bring the branding up to date?
Yes. Well, I want an action to get proper design on the interface as a whole, and to sit down and show them the install path that we expect to create by the end of the cycle, and see if that's largely okay with them or if they foresee issues.
Right.
So this is probably scope creep for this session, but one thing I wanted to ask about is Wubi is effectively, it's the application that we kind of want to present people with to do as a Windows user, as a vehicle for getting Ubuntu onto their system.
Yeah.
Is there a role for this taking over some of the USB creator sort of code?
Yes. I'm glad you mentioned that. So this was something that
It's okay, nobody can hear you.
yeah. And so this feeds back into the design thing as well, because that had been asked for, and I have no idea how this should look. I mean, it just strikes me as something being an immensely complicated interface.
So there seem to be three use cases that we want to make sure are covered. One is installing to your existing hard drive.
Yeah.
One would be adding something onto an external USB sort of drive as a live image. And the third one, I think, is actually running a CD. I think the third of those is actually less and less important. So if I were to order them, it would be the order I just said. But I think we don't really. So right now we don't have a good story for the latter two on Windows. There are some tools available. Sorry.
USB creator for this exists.
But it's not well integrated with the website, I don't think, and it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it'll help once we move to hybrid CDs.
Yeah.
That doesn't give us a good story for persistency or anything,
But probably not important to that set.
but it gives us a good story for installation, or a better story for installation. I don't know if. Well, I suspect that it's easier to find tools for Windows that just blap an image onto a USB stick than that do the stuff, the specialized things that USB Creator does.
Right. I mean, we already have code to largely do this in USB Creator and Wubi in terms of just basically doing DD.
Right. So the story with hybrid CDs is that it was blocked on having libisofs and that stack support JIGDO creation, which has to be done in there. If you just run isohybrid, then it breaks things. That is fixed now, at least upstream, and I think now in Debian. So it's now essentially a backport bits of infrastructure task to make that work on our CD build machine. And I intend to do that this time.
Cool. Is unrelated, but is the plus one engineer thing that we discussed with Alejandro, is that out of bound for this?
I don't think so. No, I think it's inbound for this.
So,
but I did speak with Steve briefly about this. We need some kind of clear, skill set defined. And I would say I think it's a difficult skill set to find, but.
Fast enough to actually be delivering information.
So, I mean, I think that the set of things that we've talked about here is a fairly significant, would be a fairly significant set of improvements for, would be particularly the interface flow improvements. And so I'm not desperately worried if we end up stuck with our current set of people maintaining it for another cycle. I would rather that than rush a hiring process and get it wrong.
It's probably worth just putting an item in for it, just so it doesn't get lost in terms of keeping things in sync. But the point about in the other Ubiquity session about actually measuring success failure rates in the installer should probably carry over to Wubi as well.
Okay, so just a reference to that.
Yeah, just to make sure that we do it in both places. Because if we just do it in, well, and we care about them differently, right? Like they're different sets of data, I think.
So is that an action item of any kind? Or?
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, because I think on the Ubiquity side, we implement it in an entirely different way than we do on the Wubi side. Because the Wubi side, presumably, we want to make the first mile marker of, the installation has begun at Wubi in Windows.
Oh, so you're concerned about failures there, of course.
I'm concerned about failures in the whole thing, yeah.
Right, so shall I give you an action to integrate failure rate measurement with the first stage of Wubi?
Yes.